Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch. Welcome back to you too, Ben.
G'day, mate. How are we?
Very good, very good. Last week went super well. Looks like a few people were listening to that, so hopefully there was a scene setter forward. But today we really want to have a look at the 2020 in terms of the property outlook. So it's crystal ball stuff. So what I know about crystal balls, Ben, if you go back into history as a guide, you see that crystal balls are usually laced with a million assumptions. But we really want to unpack some observations.
Property this time, Bryce. Property.
Yes. So what we think will happen in 2020. But what we have learnt from using history as a guide, Ben, when you go back to all the predictions, all the fluctuations on price, is the fundamentals remain the same. So going forward, that as a baseline, the fundamentals will remain the same. That the properties that you should be considering buying, number one, they should be second-hand, Ben, pre-loved, pre-owned, whatever you want to call them, be the second and subsequent purchaser. But also cash flow is important, and having a bigger picture idea of where you want to go. That is just basic, foundational, baseline stuff. But
correct.
Today's going to be exciting. We're going to get the Capital Growth King in to have a little chat with us today as well.
Here we are. Jeremy Sheppard will turn up later in the show.
Which is good. And then we're going to go into some data. And there's a lot of information, so there's plenty of Outlook reports. So all you have to do is Google that, Ben. But what we want to do is actually have a look at some of the data that we've got in our lab and analyse that, give it a different look on some things to give people, I guess, another opportunity to form their view about what they would like to do in 2020 and where they think the market will go. But
beautiful.
I'll kick it off today, Ben, with my Mindset Minute theme. I was away 2 weeks ago, Ben. I was in the States. It was for a conference that had a number of speakers. I was lucky enough to see Tony Robbins. He spoke for 3.5 hours, Ben. So what I thought is I wrote down some quotes, and I'm just going to quick takeaways that I got from Tony Robbins. And the first one I thought was interesting based on his philosophy of what he does is it's a biblical quote. If you want to be great, be the servant of many, Ben. I think that's really the foundation of what we want to do on our podcast. We want to serve as many people as we possibly can. So that resonated with me. He said, go for mastery, Ben, not dabbling. Don't dabble in it. So that's why the foundational pillars that we started this podcast on A, B, C, D, Ben, we want you to master those foundations, and we'll give you an opportunity to do that. You're going to love this one. I thought of you. I put a little note. Ben would like this. Execution trumps knowledge every day of the week, Ben. Because he just made a throwaway that said ideas are worthless, execution is everything. So how many people do you know have got so many ideas that just stay in the bank? So execution trumps knowledge every day of the week. I thought I liked that. This is interesting. Courage is not the absence of fear, Ben. Rather, it's being fearful but doing it anyway. So it's a really good reframe, because if you think of people who are courageous, they've still got fear. But they are action takers, because I think in life you really need to be good at two things. You need to problem solve, you need to take action. Because if you can do those two, particularly in combination, Ben, that will set you up for success. He goes, just face your fear of failure. Anyone who's successful has failed a lot, Ben. They just call it learning. All right. So hopefully we can help people make less failures when it comes to buying the wrong properties.
Especially when big lots of money are involved.
A couple of final ones are the RAS, the Reticular Activation System. You've heard that before, Ben, where you're driving along, you're going to go and buy a red Toyota, and then all of a sudden you see red Toyotas everywhere. He says you've got to use RAS to your advantage. So if you're thinking about how I want to be better at habits, you read James Clear's book or whatever. If you make a predetermined mindset that that's what you want, that becomes part of your reticular activation system, and all of a sudden you see it everywhere.
Nice.
So the clarity is the power. Wherever focus goes, energy flows. And the last one, he said this, it was quote, Ben, everyone should create an investment money machine that works in your sleep.
Yes.
Everyone should create an investment money machine that works.
Is that like passive income from property investing, Bryce?
I would have thought there was some similarities in that. So
maybe. Well, he's interested in money mastery as well. He's got a great big book on it.
He is.
It's a big read. And he's interviewed some of the best minds that have built assets that then drive income, but the assets drive the income. And I think we're on the same path for helping people grab a couple of good investment properties and add that to the mix. And then, you know, life could be a little bit easier for some.
Ben, do you know how, like, from the outside in, I'd seen lots of imagery of people being at a Tony Robbins seminar, and there's so much energy, they're jumping, and I'm thinking, what the dickens are they doing, right? But I can assure you, when you're he is an unbelievable energy creator.
Yes, he
like,
is.
I was one of the guys jumping up and down like everyone. I took video footage. There's 4,500 people in the room. We're all jumping up and down. So there you go, folks. A few takeaways. Hopefully 1, 2, or maybe all of them will land for you. Ben, today let's talk about the property market outlook for 2020.
Yeah, well, I thought we'd set up with just a bit of scene setting on the economy. Obviously, the economy plays a very, very big role in a lot of aspects. Now, the irony is the economy is a measure of the activity that's happening in the economy. And so we need to take a deeper dive into sort of what some of those metrics are. And obviously, each month I do my Reserve Bank opinion piece. And, you know, the economy is now seeing a couple of bit of headwinds. One is obviously the big one, the global one, is the coronavirus. And now we're talking about vaccines maybe being 12 to 18 months away. So that is a big challenge for the global economy. And we're going to see China is already, you know, sort of got cities in lockdown where that's obviously having a big impact. And we're a big exporter of products to China, and then travel's also affected. So obviously tourism money coming in, obviously international students, those types of things are going to play a role in terms of what happens to our broader economy.
Only this morning, Ben, one of our biggest, largest, most trafficked Chinese restaurants in Chinatown has closed its doors because of the fact that no one was coming in. That's 40 full-time staff, the whole shooting mass. And interestingly, there's been a massive increase in Google searches on the corona beer virus. So people are not... That wasn't intended to be a joke. It's just in terms of people
it's sad, isn't it,
misinformed around what is actually going on. But it's a it's a
urban myths. Like there's urban myths going around about soup and bats in soup, and like, I mean, there was a nice piece on the 7:30 program. I think it was last night's episode where they basically fact from fiction, right? And so the facts are that coronavirus in any cooked food will die. It will not pass through by food. And they asked that, you know, will you get it from eating in a restaurant? And the fact of the matter is very unlikely, right? It needs to pass in saliva. You would need to be very close to that person to be able to do. So all of these sort of elements are fear-mongering and scaring, and it doesn't need to be the case. I mean, yes, it's obviously killing people. You need to be vigilant, and, you know, face masks will help. But, you know, these health experts were clearly saying you don't need to wear a face mask walking around Australia. Right? You just do not need it. There is no reason for such a thing to occur. But if you're in the epicentre, then that's going to be very, very helpful for whether you're a carrier of it or you know, you're infected. So anyway, but that's a by the by. But the point being is it does absolutely, it's going to have an impact on the economy. And we're talking about the property outlook here. But what we are sort of talking about is things like economic growth, retail trade, the equipment investment that's occurring, employment, construction jobs, population growth, housing finance, you know, housing starts. Those types of things are what makes up the economy. Now, those numbers, for the astute people will understand, they're the type of measures that you see in the State of the States economic report that we get from the Commonwealth Bank. So if it's free to download, so you can have a look at that and read what's happening in each of the states. Because even though we're going to be doing a fly around right now, Bryce, there are markets within markets, and we've pulled some data from the lab in terms of the Select Residential Property Lab, our research house, and we're going to share a bit of that data as we go around state by state. Now, there is a few numbers there, so, you know, hopefully we realise that this is an audio podcast, but from that point of view, we should be able to, you know, hopefully paint you a bit of a picture, and then we're going to reiterate, because the picture we want to paint you is even there's markets within markets, which was what we've always been about, and some of these markets are outperforming others. And so we're going to do a bit of scene setting, and then to close out the show, we'll bring Jeremy Sheppard in, the Capital Growth King, and we want to take a bit of a deeper dive into some of the patterns that he's seeing inside some of those broader markets to give people a bit of an idea of where they should be looking to invest in 2020.
Very good, Ben. So let's dive in.
Let's dive in. So, well, I'll start with Sydney, obviously our largest capital centre. Who knows for how much longer with population growth happening in Melbourne, but we'll see how we go. Now, so here's the scene setup. What I'm doing here is I'm going to be talking to you about what the last peak was. So it peaked, based on our data, the typical value peaked at $930,000, and that occurred in June of 2018.
Let's do a quick typical value versus median.
So how we do it is we grab a series of different median values, test them against that, and we call it our own typical value because it's sort of a median of a medians that we gather, but the reality is we just have a terminology called typical value for that particular thing. So 930, it peaked in June of 2018. The trough was actually recorded in August of 2019. And when we called it, I said it'll be the bottom. So we got, and that was $807,000 in August of last year.
So typical value come up of 123,000, Ben. So 13.2%. 13.2% decline, and that slide period was 14 months. Okay, so now in terms of as at the 1st of Feb, using our data sets, we have the typical value currently in Sydney of 852,000. Yep.
And so the recovery so far on our data is $45,000 has come back.
852 minus 807.
Correct. And so that's 5.6%. Now the recovery period, or the growth period, as one might call it, it's a recovery because we're not back over the peak, has been 5 months so far. So there's still $78,000 to regain since the last peak. And so we're still negative 8.4%. Sort of makes sense, doesn't it? So hopefully everyone's following us. Then we go into, okay, well, what's the count of the market? And this is where we want to get into, right, in terms of markets within markets. So there's 853 suburbs that we monitor in the Sydney's greater marketplace. Now, in reality, even though the recovery is 5.6%, we wanted to find the markets that were 20% higher than that broader market. And we did. We found 158 suburbs.
We did.
Whereby their performance has been 20% or greater, and their average performance hasn't been 5.6, it's been 6.7.
Yep.
Now, if that was to continue, that 1% difference is material.
You bet.
It is a huge amount in terms of over a 10 or a 20-year period. So
we're talking 20% better than the average recovery of 5.6. So that's why we're at that point it's 6.7. So there's 158 or 19% of the Sydney market that's actually done better. So because the drill point here is we've always said you're not buying Sydney.
No, you can't buy Sydney.
You're not even buying a suburb, you're buying
Exactly.
a property within a suburb. So the important point here is to highlight that on the ground, there's actually, we could go the other way and show the ones that haven't done as much. But the point is if there is a bit of science that goes to asset selection, so if you know what to look for and you know what to buy the right ones and you know the signs, you can actually get an outperform result.
Location does 80% of the heavy lifting, right? I mean, it's an 80-20 principle that we always talk about. It's not an exact science, it's a broad statement because you can still buy the wrong asset in one of the best suburbs. And so we go on though, Bryce, don't we? We go on. So that was 20% outperform. How many suburbs, Bryce, had a 50% outperformance?
Oh, do you want me to guess based on the fact that I know the data?
No, just tell us.
Sticky, how many? 98, Ben, which is 11, so 50%. So we're talking 8.4%.
Yep.
Since the bottom.
Yeah, so compared to 5.6, so that's almost 3%. Now, if you do 3% compounding,
3%, that's pretty good.
It is pretty incredible.
So 8.4% is the benchmark. So there's been 98 of those 853 suburbs, Ben, which equates to just a bit over 1 in 10. 1 in 10 have done 50% or better than the average recovery since the trough. So
love it.
All right, I'll do.
So can we? Now, what I want to do is just say let's quickly talk about Sydney. So, what do we like about Sydney? We like both houses and units more broadly. So, if we think about where their demand supply, they're still in balance, but some suburbs are outperforming others, and we'll take a deeper dive with Jeremy in a minute. But the point we make, we like their economic credentials. It's a big mass employment centre. There's lots of infrastructure and construction going on, so we like that. So we're bold on houses, where we delight in townhouses where you get a bit of parcel of land, But the Sydney market is unique compared to the other markets around apartments. They have the most density, significantly more density than any other capital city. So we do like 1 and 2 bedroom apartments as investment opportunities. We're not so thrilled on studios, but we do like 1 and 2 bedroom apartments in that market. But what are the caveats, Bryce?
Well, the caveats are that they have to be old school, low density, all of the stuff that we talk about in terms of, and in the shadows of some challenges around cladding construction, it actually gives you comfort when you buy, irrespective of the fact they've got a track record, Ben, irrespective of the fact that they were built in better locations, the fact that it stood the test of time, it's been there since 1960 or in some cases the Deco period, the fact that there is no extensive cracking, you can check that out, it gives you comfort versus something that the crisis of confidence that you have in the brand new stuff is the fact that, okay, it sounds good, I can go and see the track record of the developer, it looks pretty good and there's a good mix between owner-occupiers and investors, so I could actually draw a little bit of comfort from that, but then you go, well, I'm still actually taking a long walk off a short plank because I don't know how it's going to stack up.
Low maintenance, low holding costs, no lifts, no gyms, no pools, been around for a long time, giving you evidence of the low maintenance. Those types of things are critical. Sinking fund, how the body corporate's managed will all play a role in the decisions that we make on whether we go after that type of asset. But we are absolutely walking away from medium and high density or suburbs earmarked for rapid expansion of those medium and high density. We'd prefer to play a couple of streets away or on the fringe of that suburb and get the drag up value of these new fancy buildings that are being built and the infrastructure that it brings in, including the shops and the parks and all of that they have to provide as part of their master plan of development. We'll get on those coattails, but we won't necessarily have to fork out on an ongoing basis because, as Anthony Robbins talks about, build the asset, build something that grows at night. We don't want to give all that money away for the quarterly management fees that we're going to be paying. So they're the types of things. So Sydney is a unit market for us.
It is, and it's unique too, Ben, in the fact that it's unlike other cities, Brisbane to a certain extent, but it's still got room to grow. The fact that Sydney has these geographical constraints. They have an ocean, they have a national park, they have a mountain range, and then they have a river system. And even to the point within micro parts of Sydney is that the people in the south don't want to travel to the north for work and north for the south. And therefore you have all these people with all these geographical constraints, with large bodies of water and this beautiful temperate climate. Therefore it creates these little subsections of that city that you would see that some of these results that are outperformers would be part of. So you're right, the density there is different as opposed to my hometown, Ben, where apartments are still a long way to go.
Overlay engineering, quality of build, because they rushed them up, some of these medium and high density stuff as well. And you've got a story to say that you know how to do your homework when you're looking at apartment markets in Sydney, but it's definitely should be part of your mix. We've always said over the long term, we would love to see clients holding assets in the 2 biggest capital knowledge centres and employment centres in the country.
If we go back to 30,000 feet, Ben, where we're saying for our goal is where we can is to get our clients exposed to having real estate in Melbourne and Sydney.
Yep.
Now, for a lot of clients who in Sydney they've got bigger principal place of residence value, may have bigger equity, therefore the opportunity to buy a house may exist. But for other people, if you're in Adelaide, if you're in Perth, or you're in Melbourne, or in Brisbane, you're trying to get into that market. Potentially the apartment market may be the only way that you can get your foothold into that market. So. Correct.
And I mean, what we're talking about here for the investor also rings true for the owner-occupier. So what we love seeing at the moment is the record number of first home buyers trying to get into the market. That's a great news story for the economy. That's a great news story for them personally. So, our principles of asset selection apply to you as well. So, if you're new to the podcast and you're thinking, well, I'm not an investor, everything we've just been talking about in Sydney is relative to the opportunity that presents itself in that particular market. Now, we spend a lot of time in Sydney. We're not going to do, when we get to Darwin and all that, we're not going to have a deeper dive because in relative terms, they're not scalable size markets. And even though they're capitals of that state or territory, there's not much to talk about there in terms of that. We know that areas like Geelong and cities like Newcastle and the Gold Coast and Sunshine are bigger than sort of Darwin and the Hobart markets as well. So we won't be spending as much time on those.
All right, well, let's run a line over Melbourne then. So for using the same metrics that you talked about for Sydney, so the typical value at the last peak, 685, and that was in December of 2018. So the last trough, it dropped down to 633 back in October of 2019. So peak to trough is $52,000 give back, which was a negative 7.6% of the value, and that took 10 months for that slide. So if you fast forward now to current day, or 1st of February, a few days ago, $662,000 is the typical value. So the recovery, compared to Sydney at $45,000, in Melbourne has been $29,000, making it a 4.6% recovery over a period of 3 months, Ben, but still, since the previous peak, you're still off 23,000.
Now, I'm going to talk to the more advanced and well-read members of our community. You would probably be thinking, well, those numbers don't align with the likes of CoreLogic and all of the other data houses. That's because the data that we're collecting is still lag data, whereas the likes of CoreLogic and their home value index is basically trying to read the live market as it falls. We're basically saying, and even though our data is till February, effectively we're a little bit more succinct and patient with the data collection that we do, because if you think about it, a lot of the data records don't come out for a month or 2 or 3 after we get to that stage. So that's just for clarity. So,
well, while you talk about CoreLogic, Ben, it's worth talking about the fact that they value the market at $7 trillion.
Yep.
And they've got the debt against that, outstanding mortgages at $1.82 trillion. So it's a 26% LVR.
So hence why you get the RBA and all that talking about they're not too worried about the broader property market.
But why is that important? Because you're going to see a lot of stories, and there was some this week, where people are saying we've got an affordability issue, and that's not a serviceability issue, Ben, when it talks to can you service the loan. An affordability where they do a measure of the amount of your income that you've got to pay for the mortgage. Bear in mind, with that much equity in the marketplace, yes, some people are hocked to the eyeballs, but a lot of people who are transacting, Ben, in locations where the income ratio to the price value doesn't make sense to a economist or someone who's running the stats. They've got equity. They might be putting a big bit of cash. They might be having a 60% LVR or a 50% LVR or a 70% LVR. So it's worth thinking about that as a context whenever you're hearing some of the news that's coming out, because we're in a cycle where the affordability index is coming up saying, oh, we're overvalued.
Yep, love it. So if we talk about from trough to where we are now, and what we've got back from the net losses since the peak, Melbourne's sitting at negative 3.4, so almost at recovery, and it's only $23,000 off its peak. So now we're going to talk about the count of the Melbourne suburban area. So we've got Greater Melbourne has 625 suburbs, and so of those, we're going back now to our 20% outperformance. There was 135 suburbs, or 22% of the 625, that outperformed that growth figure. And so that the recovery growth figure was 4.6. These have done an average of 5.5%. So again, almost 1% better than the broader market. So here's that markets in market story. And I'll round that out by then going to 50%. So these have done an average of 6.9% growth over that same period. And there's 84 suburbs that have done that, or 13% of the market. So again, you need to look at the demand and supply drivers in these pockets where you're going to get your best bang for buck and turn the dial on a greater return for yourself.
Yep, agreed, Ben. So what's interesting about if you sort of juxtapose that against Sydney, which is a strong sort of high density market, Melbourne has pretty much for the last 10 years some of that high density stuff, including certain pockets of the types of property that we would recommend, or that would say would be investment grade, hasn't done so well, Ben. So it's interesting that anecdotally you're having conversations with millennials right now. I had one on Saturday night where they would typically be looking to buy something that's a house or some land component with a townhouse, and absolutely refuse to consider the idea of buying an apartment. Let's not distinguish between apartments at this point, but would refuse. The conversation was, I refuse to consider an apartment. I said, well, okay, that's good. Well, based on what you can afford, that means you're going to have to go way out. Oh no, I won't go way out, Ben. I'm not going to go way out. I'm like, okay, well, we've got a circular reference here because you're not going to you can't afford that, but you won't go there, but you can't afford that, but you won't go there. So what are you going to do? And then it was really a case of talking about the fact that this particular person said, I want to stay close to mum and dad. I want to stay close to what I know. And in these areas, a house, Ben, would cost you, a typical value house would cost you 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. So it's in that inner north part of in Melbourne. So therefore, these conversations will be happening in plenty of lounge rooms for the next 6 months going, oh, we used to live in Melbourne. We used to always be able to say, no, I'll definitely only get a house or I'll definitely only get a townhouse. And now the actual value dictates that, wow, for the first time, well, not for the first time, but for a significant time for Melbourne, they'll be going, okay, maybe, just maybe, I might need to stretch my mind to the fact that if I'm going to stay firm on where I want to be, I am going to have to consider buying an apartment. And so our message to those people is clearly distinguished between the two. But
correct.
Therefore, I think and I'm not making a prediction, Ben, but I am saying...
Well, you are, but you're not making it for 2020.
Yeah.
I think that's the important point, right?
Because I don't want people to run out and say... But what I am saying is that the evidence has to, when there's positive population growth coming in, and Melbourne, unlike Sydney, has this ever-expanding ability to grow. I mean, you can just add new subdivision after new subdivision.
Huge volcanic basin.
For infinity.
Yep.
Oh, well, that's a bit over the top. It's not infinity. You eventually reach China. But yeah, the point is that unlike Sydney, that is very geographically constrained, Melbourne doesn't have that.
Yep.
So it can sprawl for a long time.
Yep.
But people in the city, if they want to stay closer, these are the decisions that they're going to be having.
The human behaviour kicks in, Bryce. Congestion on the rail lines, congestions on the roads, the slog to get to work, that's not living, right? And the younger people who want everything closer in, they potentially feel like they're going to get that bang for buck in those areas. The status of certain areas, they all play a role. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the differences will get to a point where it will drag up unit prices. People will ultimately make the choice when they're thinking about our decision quadrant in terms of price and location and type of property and condition. All of those things will come out and they'll go, I'm ready. And as we talked about, the mindset in Sydney, it's not even a second thought. The mindset in Melbourne is going to shift, and I've always believed that it'll shift in from full freestanding houses to semis, to townhouses, to villas, to apartments.
Yep.
And that's the chain of command that goes into, well, what can I get where I've got some land? I mean, traditionally Victorian people have a mindset of conservatism, and that sort of shows up in terms of that. But it's going to come. I mean, we're seeing the density start rolling out. So what are we saying about the market? We're saying that Melbourne still looks, in terms of knowledge centre, biotech centre, certainly fashion and cultural capital, sporting capital, all of those things play well to a strong livability of our city that we live in. And so we think that Melbourne, absolutely, from even when you compare it to Sydney, in terms of what value you get in Melbourne, that there's tremendous opportunity when we talk more broadly about the market. But again, you've got to pick the eyes out of it. You don't want to be caught up in, not doing your homework and just basically throwing a dart on a dartboard. And you want to be looking at some of those positive drivers. I mean, Melbourne has really strong retail. It's got good economic data, good employment data, good growth figures. So there's some really good positives for Melbourne to say that over the course of this year and into the future, that Melbourne presents some pretty good opportunities if you do your homework.
Yep, absolutely. Brisbane, Ben, 481 was the typical value at the last peak.
Yes.
That was in January of 18. The last trough was 437, Ben, in August of 2019. So that's a drop of $44,000, meaning it gave back 9.1%, and that slide happened over 19 months. But as of now, the typical value is 447. So that recovery has been 10,000, just a bit over, meaning it's been a 2.4% recovery since that trough over 5 months. But since the peak, you're still off $33,000. So that's 7% since the peak.
Beautiful. Now let's have a look at the markets that are outperforming. So we've got in our data sets 491 suburbs. Markets that have got a 20% outperformance are 84, which represents 17% of the total marketplace, and their average return has been 2.9% as opposed to the recovery percentage, which is 2.4%. And then we look at the 50% significant outperformance. We've actually got 13% of the market at 66 suburbs, and they've got a 3.6% differential compared to 2.4%, so over 1.2%. So you want to be looking at these markets from a demand and supply point of view, and you want to also argue to yourself that you want sustainable demand over the long term, because markets will always come back into balance. There will always be periods of imbalance and then coming back into balance. So we're starting to see more of these markets showing up that are going to be in balance, and that's where we get capital growth. The imbalance on the other side, where its supply exceeds demand, we get the imbalance, and obviously that's where we see property prices decline.
So in Brisbane, we're seeing clearly the appetite is for houses.
Yes.
And in some cases, you know, the multiple offer scenario has been. I can assure some of our listeners that just this week we missed one where we were one of 13
offers.
13
wow.
offers. And as interesting as that sounds, Ben, multiple offer is the norm. And the fact that we have to be very, very sharp on our ability to read the play in some of these suburbs makes it very, very challenging. But it also just goes to show that the price point, the price disparity between the two biggest cities, the yields that on offer. In Brisbane, part of the play is the fact that there's granny flats that you can do up there. So there's a demand for that where they can increase the yield. So there's a bit of that playing, but clearly there's an appetite for houses up there. Hey, Perth's an interesting story,
Well,
Ben.
can I just also highlight for Brisbane, what also stands up, even for their apartment market, Bryce, is the yield story is really strong, right?
Well, the supply's kind of started to be absorbed.
Yep.
So clearly there was a big blind spot on the data around before that came, and then all of a sudden it came, and then that really threw their unit market around, but that's been absorbed.
Correct. So in Sydney, you've got vacancy rates of 3.2% and a yield of 3.6%. In Melbourne, you've got vacancy rates of 2.3% and a yield of 3.6%. Brisbane's 2.7 is the vacancy rate, but the yield is 4.8. Now, so when you are still buying these properties, don't think you're automatically going to get your 4.8 because that's a global number. But I do, you know, I think what bodes well for the Sydney unit buyer, if they're buying in a very small block in beautiful areas, some of the more pristine areas, that there's a good cash flow story there for the short term. With growth to follow.
Well, that's what we found with our clients. There was that blind spot around that supply, which has been a challenge. But we've been focusing on blue chip suburbs in those older school investment grade assets that'll do well over time. But the yield story has been good on those.
Beautiful. So I think it's going to be, the houses are going to be one to watch in Brisbane, Vegas and the surrounds. In 2020.
Yep, agreed. Hey, in Perth, this is an interesting one because if you have a look, it was
oh my God,
the last peak 535. You think, well, that was pretty good. That was back in the days when it was the second highest median in the country, right? And there I'm thinking, whoa, how's Perth? It was all grown up. But that was in September of 2014. The last trough was 414,000, and that was recorded we're in the shadows of that, Ben, back in November of last year. So $121,000 has come off, but that slide has represented almost a quarter, 22.6%. And that slide so far to date, which hasn't really hit its bottom yet, wow.
Well, it has. We've just come off that, but it was 62 months.
Yeah, 62 months.
So giving up 121,000.
Perth's my hometown, Ben. Yes. You may or may not know this, but
I think I do.
But I do have friends over there who've had portfolio exposures just in that market, and it's been a painful decade for them. Yeah, it's been a really, really painful decade.
And it highlights the borderless investing strategy, and diversification is not just in shares; it's also in property in that respect.
So the 1st of Feb, 424 means that the recovery has been $10,000 since that bottom back in November of 2019. But we still
so from September of 2014, that's been the recovery, right? So yes, you're right. There's 10,000 up from November,
correct,
last year.
So that's 2.4%.
Yep.
So and that's just been a couple of months, right? So we're off 111 since the peak now, rather than that 121. But here's the deal: the number of markets we're analysing is 382 markets in Perth.
Yep.
So 20% better than the average would just put it at 2.9, and there's been 29 of those suburbs,
or 8% of the market.
And 3.6 would put it 50% above that average, and it's 24 or 6% of that market. But what I find interesting about Perth, Ben, is we've run a ruler over it, right?
All the time we do. We are going to get there at some point.
But it's interesting though, because if you have a look, a lot of the recoveries come from the inner ring, which is the higher price point suburbs. So we as an investment, client on behalf of our clients, we're looking at that going, all right, well, if we're going to pay that type of dollar, we'd probably put it over this side of the country because of where it is. But then if we go and chase the price point that we're interested in, we're going 45 k's out, Ben, to the north, where our data is suggesting there's a bit of demand. And it kind of just becomes a reflection point for us going, well, do we want to be, at that price point, do we want to be 45 k's out from Perth, which has had a pretty tough run, or would we put that into Adelaide, or would we put that into Brisbane? I think that's the challenge, because I think everyone wants Perth. You know, it's been for so long, it's at the bottom, but it's not like it's just a lay down misère that it's going to turn around, because the demand. You know, I do know there are some of our peers that are over in that market. Yep. But I still.
Well, it could be another half a decade before it turns. So we are measuring demand and supply all the time there, Bryce. And I think the other point for us is, if you're in that sort of 350 to 550 price range, we are going to buy in that price range at some point over there. The data is going to get to a position where we'll go, but as you say, there's only 6% that has got a 3.6% return, a 3.8% return. Now, compared to, say, in Sydney and Melbourne, you've got 8.4s and 6.9s. And you've got 11% of the market and 13% of the market giving you those returns. So the reality is it's opportunity cost.
Correct, because in a vacuum, you look at Perth and you go, in a vacuum, great, green shoots, there it is, but we're not making decisions in the vacuum. We're making the decisions in the context of the entire country.
And what we like about, when it absolutely was at its worst, vacancy rates were around 5 to 6%. There was real choice, which obviously meant that landlords had to drop their rents. Yields are sitting at 4.6%. I had the luxury of spending 3 weeks over there with my family, and driving around the different markets and starting to do some analysis. And there's just still too many for sale signs out there, right? So I want to see that supply.
It's imbalance.
Absorbed.
It's not in demand exceeding supply.
Yeah, exactly.
It's more just balance.
It was in balance in terms of oversupply. That's coming up into balance. We needed to get some momentum from that. Now the data's suggesting, in terms of the economy, it's actually showing signs, right? But it still might be 12 months away, right? It still might be 14 months away. And to our community, we will let you know.
We are watching.
We will let you know when we think that marketplace, because it is going to be a significant buying market for us at some point, to accommodate some of our clients who need that price point plus the yield to get a bit of growth. If they're looking for a balanced asset, as opposed to trying to get them into pure growth assets where we have to pay a little bit more for those particular assets. So
for those people that are in that market, you'd want to be getting the apples into apple pie sites, where there's opportunity for upside at some stage.
Yeah. So. Well, that's just an insurance policy too, right? You can still keep that single property on there and keep it renting out, but you know that you've got an insurance policy that your land can be subdivided and developed later on. So it's an interesting market. We'll keep an eye on it. We'll report back in halfway through the year.
Okay, cool. Like it. Hey, let's do Adelaide. 452,000. The peak was in January of 2018. That was a typical value peak. The last trough was 391, also in November of last year. That's come off 61,400, which is a slide of 13.6, and that's been over 22 months.
And then from the 1st of February, the marketplace is telling us typical value of 401. Recovery's been 10,000. The recovery is currently sitting at 2.6%, and we are talking about the 2 months, so it's very, very close. The negatives on that, from loss to the peak, was 51,400, and so that net loss is still sitting at 11.4%. Total numbers in that particular market of suburbs that we're monitoring, 434 suburbs. The 20% or greater has yielded a 3.1% return. That's 27 suburbs or 6% of the market. In terms of significant outperformance, there have been 17 suburbs, which represents 4% of the market. This is a fascinating little market. It's just chugs along, just does its thing. But in some of the better areas, we've seen real material, and this is where we come back to, that's a global story of Adelaide, and I know it's still only 434 suburbs, because they are quite small suburbs over there in Adelaide. But it just goes to show you that you can pick the eyes out of that one. And that's what we have been doing. Yeah. We've documented that we've been buying in Adelaide for quite some time. We just love the scarcity so close to the city. So when you're talking about before, to get that price point in Perth, you've got to go at 30. To get good price points, sub 700, you can still be within single digits kilometres from the city or single digit kilometres from the beach. And we think Adelaide will tell that story as our more broader population over the next 20 years will grow to 35 million or whatever it goes to.
They've got such beautiful homes in close with those stone.
They do. So we do like the scarcity.
But we're buying there in with a 4 in it, Ben, 400 and something.
So there you go. So look at vacancy rates, 1.5%, tightly held, yield sitting comfortable at sort of 4.7%. So just a good news story there, and that's why it's got a fairly good demand supply score at the moment. So we do like that. We keep trying to run the ruler over, and we bought spasmodically some of the apartments.
Is that anything like spasmodically?
Spasmodically. Yep. There you go. I've done it the wrong way. Spasmodically.
That's the one. I like the way you roll.
Thank you. So we have bought the odd apartment in that market when we just know it's walk to the beach or whatever it is. But traditionally, we're buying houses in that particular market and what we would call character houses, more so than not.
The units are in the super blue chip stuff, Ben.
Correct.
Okay, let's do Canberra. 582 typical value. In April of 2019 was the peak. The trough was 538.5 in December of last year. Dropped 43.5, Ben, or 7.5%, and that slide took 8 months. Fast forward to the typical value now, or in February, 552. Which sees the recovery of $13,500 or 2.5%, and that's just taken 1 month. So we're $30,000 off since that peak, or 5.2%. So if we analyse the total number of markets being 152, that moderate outperformance at 3% versus 2.5%, there's 6 suburbs or 4%. And then if we go to 3.8, which would represent 50% or better, there's 3 suburbs that have done, which is 2% of the market.
So there you go. So it just goes to show you that we don't talk much about Canberra because of the land tax issue, and basically all of your funds are just going straight back to the government. There's just no money to take off the table in in Canberra. So that's just something we need to be mindful. If you're an owner-occupied buyer there, I still see growth. I see building starts, demand, housing finance is really high in that particular market. So we expect it to grow. It's just that from an investor's point of view, it's not a market to play in because you don't get to keep any of the money that you earn, and so it's just a real cash burden in terms of the amount of money you have to keep kicking into that particular marketplace.
All right, Ben, Hobart.
Hobart's
done pretty good.
Well, the number one performer over the period. So let's go through that one, Bryce.
You go for it.
Okay, so last peak was 380, and we're talking about August of 2017, and the last trough was 351,500, so pretty close to each other in September of 2017. Now, so the slide has only been 28 or negative 7.5. 1 month is only been since the slide. So are we peaking? Well, no. We look at the typical value today is 465. The recovery has been 113,500. Or 32%, and that's been 28 months of recovery. So it's up 85,000, and that is recorded since the last peak was 22.4%. So what we're saying here is 85,000 gain. What we're seeing now is this market is its record levels. So it's had a great run. The question is how much longer this run's got to go. Do you take profits? Do you hold on? What do you do in this particular market? And I'm sort of saying, because when it does go back into balance, it can stay in balance for a long period of time.
This is an important point to talk about, Ben, because this is the reason why we didn't. We were not tempted to put clients' money into this market because of what's happening now. You've had that run, which is great, but what happens from this point forward historically suggests
we prefer buy and hold, and so we don't want to be sitting in that market and then telling our clients 5 years from now, no, it's not going to do anything for another 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
So you have to sell. And so some of that profit's got to be paid tax on.
Yep.
And then obviously you've got stamp duty and what we call recycle costs. So,
well, what happens is if a group of people will start doing that, Ben, well, then there's more stock on market, which then there's the price discounting, which means that you're realising less. So not only are you realising less that you had on your balance sheet, but you're also paying some off to the government.
Now, in terms of outperformance, there's only 99 suburbs in Hobart, and so what we have seen is that they're again, just highlights. Even in a booming market, there are still some suburbs that do better than others, and we've identified 12 of those suburbs, which represent 12% of the market for the 20% outperformance, and then the significant outperformance of 50% or more, and the average for these particular markets has been 48.4 compared to the 32.3, there's been 7 of those suburbs, which represent 7% of the market. So if you put your money into those particular markets, you've done incredibly well, right? The value of your property has gone up almost 50% over that time.
So the last one, Ben, is Darwin, right? So as we've talked about before, it's a capital city, which is why it gets reported, but there's probably a couple of other markets that you'd probably want to report before this one, particularly given what's going on there. But let's run through the numbers. Typical value at last peak, 559.5. That was in October of 2014.
Mm-hmm.
The last trough was $389,000, 300, which was in December of 2019. So that's come off 170,000, a bit over, or a bit over 30%. And that's been going for 62 months, Ben. Not too dissimilar to our friends over at the Nullarbor.
Literally, we've found the bottom. It's 1 month in recovery.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunately a bit of a horror story for them now. Even with the outperforming suburbs, you're still not getting a great return at 3.5% for the 20% or above has been the average return of those. And there's been 2 suburbs of the 50, which represents 4%, and the 50%, again, is only 4.4%. Which is way under what we would try and get from other suburbs. And we're talking about significant outperformance 2 suburbs or 4%. So that's not great. So there you go. Now, for those of our community who are like, God, lots of numbers,
yes,
we are going to share this table so you can download it, have a look at it, study it for yourself, and have a look at that. So to the community, you know where to go to the show notes, and we'll guide you in the right direction to get that particular download.
So let's summarise that, Ben. You've got there's opportunity in Sydney, given of where it is, and the fact that you would want to have property in that market, depending on where your budget allows you and where you see the opportunity. So there's places to find opportunities there. Melbourne has still got a big price disparity between what you can buy in Sydney and what you can buy in Melbourne for bang for buck, and so there's definitely still opportunity here, but. Maybe keep your mind open, Ben, to the fact that we may start to mirror our sister city, well, not our sister city, take that out, our esteemed city with the more population than us that you alluded to, they might lose their crown to Melbourne soon, but so keep that in mind. Brisbane, definitely houses there, there's opportunities there. Perth, from our perspective, it's well and truly worth keeping your eye on that market, but from our own perspective, we're not jumping yet. Adelaide, we've had clients in there. We still see value in houses, and that market has moved somewhat. Canberra for owner-occupiers is still seeing opportunity. Caution around Hobart, whether or not that's had its run, and whether or not you formed a view. Our view is that there may be at its peak there, and maybe that might be a sign of what you would expect for the next few years. And of course, Darwin. At this stage, there's no cause for us to believe that you should be considering that as an investment market this year.
And if you're buying for owner-occupier and you want to live in Canberra, that's also not a bad market to consider. So I think it's been a nice round the grounds in terms of what to look at. But now what we want to do is introduce the Capital Growth King, Jeremy Sheppard.
Yeah, welcome back, Jeremy. What's interesting, one of the reasons we wanted to get you in is because we clearly had a look at some of the data from a headline level, and we've always talked about the fact that generalised commentary doesn't help anyone. So we've gone around the grounds and talked about it from 30,000 foot, but the idea for you is to maybe drill down on some of these areas and let us know where you're seeing pockets of demand exceeding supply.
Sure. Yeah, okay. We'll start with the big one, Sydney.
Yep.
Okay, so areas that are looking pretty hot in Sydney at the moment are the northern beaches, like North Manly, Narrowena, and Beacon Hill. There's also the Sutherland Shire, like the northern suburbs of the Sutherland Shire, edging into the southern part of Canterbury Bankstown. Suburbs like Illawong and Padstow Heights. And the third pocket is in the eastern suburbs, so just east of the airport, like in Pagewood, and then further north to Paddington and North Bondi. Melbourne. Okay, it's a little more scattered with Melbourne. I'm trying to look for clusters, but it's kind of scattered here. To the northeast in Nillumbik, LGA, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah,
Nillumbik. For example, Diamond Creek, that's a good suburb, but also creeping a bit closer towards the Banyule LGA, places like St Helena and Greensborough. There are other strong pockets around the CBD, so you've got places to the east. My favourite though is South Melbourne, but you've also got Brunswick and Richmond, they're hot, and then further afield, Upper Ferntree, Gully, Croydon and Croydon Hills.
Okay, so a good blend there. So you've got some high value, typical values, and also some of the, as you're getting out wider, some of the more affordable
plenty
typical
to choose
values.
from.
So that's some good hotspots.
And Brisbane is kind of similar. It's a little bit scattered, but there are there's one to the north around Stafford Heights and Chermside West. To the east, it looks like there's a new cluster developing around Tingalpa. Tingalpa. And then the third is to the south around Mount Gravatt and Mansfield. And also favourable mention to Graceville to the southwest.
Nice
so they're all around. But they're not too far away. But it's interesting that there aren't many really hot markets right close to the CBD. It seems to be an affordability play. Perth. There was only one suburb that met the minimum criteria for a hotspot. But usually it's been just sort of west or north of the CBD, places like Wembley. But this one's South Kensington. And if I relax the constraints a bit more, a few more popped up next door, like Como and Mount Pleasant.
Okay.
So it's definitely a city that's changing.
Still blue chip country.
Definitely. That's where the growth starts in the next phase, doesn't it? Also to the north, Leaderville, but I had to relax the constraints quite a bit there. Adelaide's interesting. There's been a shift in where the heat is in Adelaide. So for the past 6 months, it's been mostly to the northwest or northeast, Modbury or Birkenhead around Semaphore. But there's a big patch that's appearing just sort of south of the CBD now. And there are a whole bunch of suburbs that have sprung up. Colonel Light Gardens has been pretty hot for a while now. But Lower Mitcham, Hawthorn, Pasadena, Netherby, Malvern, Edwardstown, Forestville, Richmond, Plimpton Park, and I left a couple out.
That's a cluster.
Yeah,
that's a real cluster.
That is a big cluster. And Canberra, so the heat is the usual Belconnen and Gungahlin to the north. So suburbs like Dunlop, Charnwood and Latham in Belconnen, and Nichols and Ngunnawal in Gungahlin. And then also to the south in Tuggeranong, you've got suburbs like Canberra, Waniassa, Gowrie, Chisholm, Richardson and Corwell. Oh, and there's also a pocket just across the border into Queanbeyan. Carrabar and Crestwood. They both look good.
Yeah, that's good. And that's in New South Wales, right? So less land tax.
Yes.
So a little tip for the punter.
That's why it's
that's why it's a good
still
one,
benefiting from that economy.
The infrastructure
that
and the economy there. That's right.
And in Hobart, there's really only one cluster to speak of, and that's in the Clarence LGA. And the best picks there are Rosny and Lindisfarne.
Geez, that's changed. Rewind 12 months on that one.
So you, obviously that's coming off. It's coming back to balance.
Well, I think there's still good growth there. Definitely, it was hot, going back a couple of years, but there's still some momentum there in that market. So still better picks than like Perth or Darwin. That's for sure.
For sure. Great.
And speaking of Darwin, there wasn't anything.
I shouldn't laugh.
I relaxed the constraints a fair bit, and the two suburbs that picked up were in Woodroffe in Palmerston and Malak, which is just north of the airport. And they were just balanced. So no alarm bells or anything, but certainly Darwin's. It looks like. I mean, it's too early to say now, but it does look like it's sort of levelling off.
Mm. So what's your view on going forward then for what you might see in some of the I know you love crystal balling, but what would be your message to property investors for 2020?
Well, I think there's great opportunities everywhere. I mean, some of that other data that you guys were going through earlier, it shows that almost every city has some opportunities. And this is just looking at the state capitals. There are tremendous opportunities in regional markets. I left out Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Central Coast, Newcastle, Maitland, Wollongong, Geelong, Ballarat. There's so many smaller, significant urban areas that aren't state capitals where there's great opportunities. It's a case of investors need to be well researched, and there's certainly no reason to hold back. There's plenty of optimism all around the country.
Very good. So Ben, just a reminder that if anyone wants to find out how their suburb is doing in terms of the demand exceeding supply, you can go to locationscore.com.au. You can plug in your suburb and we'll give you a free suburb there. But I know, how's the capital growth model going for you? Yeah,
so suburb growth and also dsrdata.com.au. February is the month that we start to focus back on. We've had our break and the property market starts to light up again. We start to see listings come through and we start to get a gauge of demand and supply. So it's really helpful that we do our outlook in February. January's too early. We're now starting to get a bit of a feed on that. So, of course, what we do for our community, we always look after them. So if anyone's looking to use any of those tools in our suite of tools under selectresidentialproperty.com.au, you can learn about the different research applications that we've got there. And we'll give a 20% as we do for our listeners at TPC20.
TPC20.
So if you put the code in TPC20, you'll get a 20% discount on suburb growth, which is our capital growth predictions calculator, location score, which does the sorting and sifting for you at the basic level.
And for those folks who want to really test whether or not they have got an asset that they should keep, there's also seller hold.
Yeah, there's seller hold. That's an interesting one, but yes, there will also be a 20%. But these times, if you're in Perth or in Darwin and you're looking for opportunity cost, we've got that one as well.
Mate, we appreciate you coming in and sharing some of the pockets that you've seen, and obviously that's part of the research that you do where demand exceeds supply, which you think is a very, very useful way to work out where you should be focusing your energy and your efforts in terms of investing. So, mate, thanks for popping along.
Thanks for having me.
Mate, just to round it off today, Ben, yes. My life hack today is very, very simple. I don't know about you, Ben, but I just had a wonderful summer where I was spending lots of time with the kids, which by and large is just a really great time.
Yep.
But there was a couple of times when, are we there yet? So we stop at a cafe or somewhere to grab a bite. And one of the little life hacks that we've worked, Ben, is we keep the in the glove box in the car. Because the kids love to smash out a couple of quick games of
Yep.
And so when we are, because my youngest is food obsessed. Life revolves around when he's eating. If he's not eating, he's wondering when he'll be eating next. Ben, when he's just finished, he wants to know what he's next eating. Everything is about eating. So when we're at a cafe, that is right up there with poking your own eye up with a sharp stick every time he goes, when's it coming? When's it coming?
And
when's
it's
it coming?
Than all screen time, right? Which is
correct. So which we definitely try to avoid. So I have found that the comes out, goes into the cafes, and we can get at least 2 or 3 games done before I get served. Before he even starts to wonder, I haven't been fed. So there you go, folks. If you've got kids like we do, Ben and myself, you maybe do that one, Ben. Did you know?
Well, I thought, given that we are talking about property, but also some of the economics that come into that, I thought I would share with you CommSec's State of the States, and I'm going to give you a couple of numbers.
Okay.
So I'm going to go around the grounds in terms of rankings.
Yeah.
So in terms of, now, just a quick backstory, they measure 8 variables, and they measure that against the long-term trend. So they're basically looking for new trends that will basically give them a score, and they score them that way. And so around the grounds, we start with Victoria at number 1. So the strongest economy is what they're saying at the moment. Tasmania at number 2, New South Wales at number 3, ACT at number 4, Queensland at number 5, South Australia at number 6, number 7 is WA, and number 8 is the Northern Territory. And I'll just round that out by looking at economic growth numbers. So we can see here, New South Wales economic growth 2.9%, Victoria 4.9%, Queensland 5%. So it's, come on, the trend. That's the annual trend we're talking about here. So it's moving. South Australia 1.3%, WA This is where the earlier signs are 12.9. Okay, so big quarter for them in terms of, and also starting to move the dial on some growth. Remember, that does take into a lot of exports. And so exports doesn't necessarily mean huge job numbers, right?
Yep.
So we don't just look at the economic growth as one indicator. Tassie at 5.5, Northern Territory 4.7, ACT at 5.1, Australia's average in terms of the movement in growth, 5.6. So a little bit of a snapshot. But again, you can download this, Google it, State of the States, CBA, and it'll come up. Ivis might even put a link in the show notes to it as well, which is helpful. So that is my Did You Know for the month.
Love it, Ben.
For the week.
For the week. Oh, I thought you were signing off for the month now.
Well, who knows? You know, we're coming up to our birthday show. Maybe I'll change it up a little bit.
Wow, very good, Ben. You did. We're turning 5.
We are, very
in
soon.
A couple of episodes' time, we get to turn 5. So who would have thought that we would last that long?
5 years old.
But we have got a big year planned on the Property Couch. We are going to ramp up the guests. We're going to ramp up the frameworks. We're going to make sure that people are well prepared to trap more surplus, Ben. Once they've had that surplus, they can put it into their preferred investment vehicle, and we'll give them a lot of information so they can make the best choices.
Brilliant.
So, mate, until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
Well said. See you next week, folks. Hey there, folks. Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listened to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now, for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarises the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.